Let's change this direction just a little bit. Okay, today I'm going to be reading from the prologue of this book, and what I am particularly interested in getting at these days is the space. There's a space between religion and psychology, and in that space there is healing, and this may be the space that Jungian analysts talk about in psychotherapy. I do not know. I get intimations of that by reading Dr. Ulanov's work. However, I am not a mental health professional, and I'm not trying to give you mental health advice here. Welcome. Nice to see you here. So what I'm going to read from is the prologue of this book, The Living God and Our Living Psyche, What Christians Can Learn from Carl Jung. And Dr. Ulanov, who's the primary author here, Dr. Ulanov is Emerita Professor of Psychiatry and Religion at Union Theological Seminary. And it was certainly a revelation to me when I realized that Dr. Ulanov had those two professorships at Union Theological Seminary. It never had occurred to me before, but she's obviously important to what I'm trying to do with this YouTube channel. So I'm going to be starting on page 13 of this prologue, and the title of this section is called The Plural Psyche. Is the human soul an indivisible unity or a conflicted plurality? From Aristotle onward, the soul has been assumed to be indivisible. Quote, Some say that the soul is divisible, and that one part of it thinks, another desires. What is it then which holds the soul together, if naturally divisible? Assuredly, it is not the body. On the contrary, the soul seems rather to hold the body together. At any rate, when the soul is gone, the body dissolves into air and decays. If then the unity of the soul were due to some other thing, that other thing would be, properly speaking, soul. Why not attribute unity to the soul? Unquote. And that's from Aristotle de Anima, published in 1961, volume 1, page 411. Many centuries later, one of the architects of modern psychology, John Locke, averred that identity meant the sameness of the self over time. The autonomous Enlightenment soul is singular and unitary. Since the power of the soul is thought, which is immaterial, it follows that the soul is a unity. French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre denied the idea of division within the person, believing that such a concept would lay the groundwork for excuses to deny the individual's absolute freedom and responsibility. The unity of the soul is an idea clearly found in some parts of the Christian tradition. After all, did not God provide each body with an individual immaterial substance called the soul? For mainstream positivist psychologists and religionists, a divided consciousness in the form of pathological dissociation or demonic possession is anathema. The unconscious, which presumably influences human behavior, is then, for the empirical psychologist, a myth. While there are negative and positive forces that shape us, they do not constitute subpersonalities within us. What then is this plurality? Of what does it consist? God describes as separate Jung, wow, there's a Freudian slip. I'm going to start at the beginning of that paragraph again. What then is this plurality? Of what does it consist? Jung describes as separate psychological realities the ego and the unconscious, the shadow and archetypal experiences, the masculine and the feminine, within one individual. Like Freud before him, Jung viewed the psyche as struggling with contending forces, incompatible parts, opposing personalities. Jung's plural psyche is composed of the complexes, which are feeling-toned groups of representations that emerge from an interaction between the unconscious and conscious experience. The complex is the basis of Jung's speaking of the little people, complexes that have a certain amount of coherence and autonomy. Complexes are splinter psyches. Rilke once observed that shattered beings are best represented by bits and pieces. Jung believed that the diversity within was not necessarily pathological, but a potential gift. This understanding of the psyche is plural. This understanding of the psyche as plural is one more way in which Jung responded pastorally and prophetically to the presumption of modernity. We begin our analysis of the cast of characters with the ego, which for Jung constitutes the center of my field of consciousness and appears to possess a high degree of continuity and identity. Although the ego generally emerges in the third or fourth year of life, one spends the first half of life developing the heroic ego, which through persistent acts of striving seeks to make it in the world. The ego is the subject of all successful attempts at adaptation, so far as these are achieved by the will. Further, the ego is typically identified with certain dominant personality traits that emerge out of this relationship with external reality, such as introversion and extroversion, thinking and feeling, sensation and intuition. In all of this, we have an excellent description of the modern ego, autonomous and unencumbered. Jung proceeded a step further with another psychological reality. Despite being the center of consciousness, the ego discovers its own limitations when confronted with the unknown, the unconscious. It experiences itself as being moved by a potent internal force. Two levels are involved in this internal subversion of ego control. One is the personal unconscious, which contains those inferior or undeveloped elements of the personality that have failed to be fully integrated into conscious awareness. The second level involves a transpersonal or collective unconscious that houses an inner experience of the transcendent, a call to more integrated ways of being. This confrontation with the transcendent imposes upon the ego a demand to submit to something higher than itself. Healthy psychological development, according to Jung, requires an increased capacity for conscious awareness of those inferior and transcendent powers that appear within the psyche. In Hegelian fashion, the ego contains the opposites and engenders a new creative alternative. The reason for midlife crises, according to Jung, is that people spend so much time in the first half of their lives with an external orientation of the world, seeking success, that they fail to acknowledge the call from their non-ego parts to greater wholeness. Those inferior personality traits submerged in unconsciousness, Jung called the shadow, the thing a person has no wish to be, the sum of all those unpleasant qualities from which one attempts to hide. The shadow, that which we reject in ourselves, may contain elements of evil and also highly positive elements. However, when the negative is not acknowledged, the shadow can develop a life of its own as a subpersonality and be unconsciously projected onto an object or person in the external world. The failure to own one's shadow is demonstrated in a case where, for example, a pastor outwardly shows vehement disdain for pornography, fighting to rid the world of such filth, yet the same individual may simultaneously be fantasizing about pornography or having a secret affair. While certainly not denying the reality of evil or the right of individuals to protest against it, Jung was concerned when someone obsessed about what he or she saw as particularly wrong behavior. The question arises, what evil do we deny in ourselves as we come to see it with such clarity in another? According to Jung, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. This psychological phenomenon highlights the importance of considering the beam in one's eye before addressing the speck in another's. The biblical reference is Matthew 7:3. We move now to an example of even greater plurality in the psyche as Jung saw it, the archetypal images. The archetypes constitute the collective unconscious, an inherited reservoir of images, wisdom, and surprises. In studying the diverse cultures of the world, Jung discovered common themes among varying myths and religious narratives. He argued, based upon Darwin's theory of evolution, that these recurring themes represented a psychological inheritance, analogous to biologically based instincts. Jung used the term archetype to describe these emotion-laden images. Which could constellate in complexes or subpersonalities. In themselves, archetypes are devoid of any specific content and require some symbol or image through which they can find concrete expression. An archetypal image is the means by which the unconscious finds cultural expression in the concrete experiences of conscious life. The image is a condensed expression of the psychic situation as a whole. Jung noted the various ways in which archetypal images can be expressed. For example, the circle, an image of completeness and infinity, has been used as a symbol depicting divinity and it's reflective of the self archetype. I just mentioned that this would include things like the rose window in the cathedral at Chartres and many other cathedrals and churches around the world. This image was used by Gustave Doré to depict Dante's encounter with God in the Divine Comedy. It is also used in Buddhism in the complex circular pattern called a mandala. Sometimes archetypal images are expressed in religious narratives, such as the death-rebirth story, the process whereby one dies to an old identity, the process by which one dies to an old identity until to be read that sentence again. The process whereby one dies to an old identity only to be reborn into a new one is found in Christianity in the experience of baptism and resurrection. This religious enactment is correlated with psychological experience when the ego learns to forgo its assumed control of the world and surrender to the call of the self. Another plurality is that of masculine and feminine as psychological realities. This is a particularly potent archetype that individuals often fail to own. Jung calls this the soul image. One's soul image represents the dominant masculine or feminine orientation of the unconscious and is portrayed as the mirror opposite of one's personality. Thus, for males, soul image is often personified as a woman, and for females as a man. Soul images are represented in mythology through certain masculine and feminine figures, such as Hercules and Helen of Troy, or, for more modern Hollywood examples, Brad Pitt and Meg Ryan. The plurality in the psyche involves play between masculine and feminine. Since the soul image is experienced as a foreign and opposing entity to the ego, it lends itself to being frequently displaced unconsciously onto external reality, most often onto a person of the opposite sex. In such situations, erotic attractions often result, in which the other is perceived as numinous, embodying all the features of one's soul image. The psyche contains an internal drive toward wholeness that evokes this longing to be united with the opposite within itself. However, when the ego fails to recognize this internal calling, psychic energy is displaced onto the real other, male or female. The failure to recognize and identify our soul image as emanating from the unconscious can result in utter disillusionment when we discover that the other does not match our archetypal fantasies. For modern people, I would say this is when the honeymoon is over. However, such crises present an opportunity to learn what qualities we lack in ourselves and are projecting outward. Hence, a man can come to know his more feminine qualities, while a woman can begin to integrate her unacknowledged masculine traits. Other prominent personified images may shape our inner plurality. They approach us in the realms of mythology, dreams, and external day-to-day experiences in images that include the wise old man/woman, the hero, and the clown. To consider a popular example, the Star Wars movie series intentionally reenacted a story based upon Jungian archetypes. There's a footnote. George Lucas, the producer and director of Star Wars, was very much influenced by the ideas of cultural anthropologist Joseph Campbell, whose work was directly influenced by Jung's theory. Reading on. In the films, Luke Skywalker represents the personification of the hero. Obi-Wan Kenobi embodies the wise old man, and C-3PO and R2-D2 reflect the clown archetype. The ominous figure of Darth Vader is the prototypical image of the shadow, while the mystical notion of the Force, the ubiquitous creative energy of the universe, is an image of the God archetype of the self. Characters such as those found in Star Wars touch on reservoirs of energy deeper than the particular stories themselves. In other words, what elicits such effective engagement in those movies is the potent resonance the stories have with the collective psyche of a particular culture. They allow us to identify with the hero, the villain, or the source of wisdom found within our psyches. This also explains the fascination with mythic stories in films such as Harry Potter, The Lord of the Rings, The Chronicles of Narnia, and The Da Vinci Code. Each provides characters and scenarios that allow us to access parts of ourselves in our plural psyches. I just observed that it's rather interesting that in the discussion of Star Wars, they've left out a description of Leia, Princess Leia, who represents the anima. So anyway, that's just an observation. Given this plethora of identities, the question naturally arises, what holds the psyche together? Jung called the lifelong struggle by the self to integrate these various archetypal images and the parts of the unconscious with the psyche individuation. This is the process by which one seeks one's fullest actualization through the differentiation and integration of all parts of the psyche. Thus, the ego is divested of identification with any one particular element of the collective unconscious, while simultaneously accepting the presence of all the elements as part of the total psyche. Although individuation, with its emphasis on differentiation, is similar to the concept of individualism, the two are, in fact, very different for Jung. Individualism means deliberately stressing and giving prominence to some supposed peculiarity, rather than to collective considerations and obligations. But individuation means precisely the better and more complete fulfillment of collective qualities. I'm going to go back and read those two sentences again because they're rather difficult to follow, I think. Although individuation, with its emphasis on differentiation, is similar to the concept of individualism, the two are, in fact, very different for Jung. Individualism means deliberately stressing and giving prominence to some supposed peculiarity rather than to collective considerations and obligations. But individuation means precisely the better and more complete fulfillment of collective qualities. So I sort of stumbled over that. I have trouble saying that one word, so I'm going to read it one more time. Although individuation, with its emphasis on differentiation, is similar to the concept of individualism, the two are, in fact, very different for Jung. Quote, individualism means deliberately stressing and giving prominence to some supposed peculiarity rather than to collective considerations and obligations. But individuation means precisely the better and more complete fulfillment of collective qualities. Unquote. In this type of development, one is more fully actualized through a lifelong process of integrating a fragmented of integrating a fragmented psyche. This healing of fragmented parts involves the reconciling of opposites. The psyche is always in a process of seeking reparation among these opposites, a union of unlike psychological qualities, sometimes symbolized in dreams by a mandala or in mythology as an androgynous figure. For Jung, then, the psyche is plural, composed of many parts, each jostling the others for control. To acknowledge the plurality of identity is to recognize both one's brokenness and the possibility of growth. To accept this plurality is to realize that one does well to pastor this inner congregation of selves. Christians should read Jung because he is a reminder of the structure of the sacralized soul. The ancient Near Eastern psyche bears certain, though not complete, resemblances to the psyche described in Jung's work. Berger, citing Paul in the New Testament, states that, quote, "The inner person is not some stable and durable interiority, but rather an invisible eschatological identity." 2 Corinthians 4:16, unquote. Thus, Paul conceives of the unified identity of the individual as a future hope to be achieved, and not as a reality to be assumed. This is not to suggest that the particularities of what that unity consists of are also the same across millennia, but there is enough semantic and practical overlap to suggest that Jung's thought may indeed be more commensurate with the views of the ancient soul than contemporary psychologists imagine. Okay, that's the first part of that. I'm going to stop for a moment because my eyes are going cross-eyed and just take a look at your comments and questions. There are a lot of them. Okay. Jonathan is listening from Buffalo. Student of rhythm. The more I live, observe, and think, the more importance I see in acknowledging the existence and the importance of the unconscious. I just had a divine revelation at work. I had to hold back tears. Laugh out loud. Good morning from New Zealand, says Ian Shekina. Student of rhythm. I see this as the best explanation for all the violence done by religious intolerance. I think there's certainly an element of that. Since I've had violence done to me by religious intolerance from Christian fundamentalists, I certainly agree with that. So much messy projection all over the place, not just religious intolerance either. It seems to be at the very core of willful ignorance. And Mr. Caleb says, I think Moana is my soul image. That could be. I think those cartoons and actually every movie is just filled with archetype these days. I mean, Hollywood caught on to archetypes back in the mid-70s, thanks to Joseph Campbell, among others. And it's gotten more and more into it without announcing it to the rest of us. Student of rhythm says, right, any ideology can assume the place of the total righteousness and greater good, even materialistic atheist ideologies like communism. Jan says, I notice archetypes of personality in all arts, books, movies, etc., and I think they are limited to Sun, Saturn, Venus, Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, while Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are in the subconscious. Well, I would say that all of them are in the unconscious. And to the extent that there are archetypes, they are in the unconscious because we cannot perfectly define them, and Dr. Jung never did perfectly define them. We can talk about them. And also just let me mention that and this was a mistake that I was making for a very long time. Subconscious and unconscious are not interchangeable in Jungian psychology. The unconscious is, as Dr. Jung says, really unconscious. And the subconscious is just things that you aren't really thinking about right now, but you have the ability to think about. Whereas the unconscious, you must experience that directly, and it's not necessarily possible to really understand what the unconscious is about except through indirectly looking at it. So for example, in Dr. Jung's landmark book, I would say, Ion, this book, which we're currently going through in the advanced reading group, Dr. Jung has, the subtitle is Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self. And what he has done is historically go back and show how all scripture, all imagery coming through human history are symbolic of the self, the part of the second part, personality number 2 of the human psyche, as he discusses it. Literally everything I watch lately or read seems to be the same story of the Sun versus Saturn, Jupiter and Venus, its love, etc., taking not only the Greek personified deities, but the collective antiquity. Quite right. And so now that you've been scratched by that cat, unfortunately you can't stop it. Once the genie is out of the bottle, you can't go back. And Student of Rhythms says, I like this explanation of individuation versus individualism. It reminds me of an art class I took where the prof said that if you try to be original, you probably won't be, but if you try to express universal things, your individuality will come out naturally. That's fine as long as that art professor doesn't presume to tell you what the universal things are, and you have to experience it yourself. And so I'm just reminded of my art class where I was taking a portrait class in pastels, and there was a model there, and the teacher came up behind me and she says, oh, you can't do it this way, you have to do it this way. I said, no, I don't. And my tendency in portrait painting is to just throw paint at the canvas. So I urge you not to be too stuck on the idea. Yes, if you paint a picture of a new mother, yeah, okay, that's gonna hit the mother archetype, but so what? So every artist these days knows that archetype, and so how many pictures of new mothers can we show? And by the same token, I think some of you have probably seen my self-portrait of me in Vietnam. Obviously, there are a zillion pictures of American men in helmets in Vietnam, and those pictures are just pictures. But in my picture, and if you haven't seen it, say so, and I'll show it at the end of this discussion. In my picture, I just threw paint. I used a photograph as the basis for the painting, but that painting contains everything that I have to say about the Vietnam War, everything. And it's most intensely expressed in the white of my left eye. And if you haven't seen that, I'll show it to you at some point here. Okay. So Student of Rhythm says, I like the notion of the outer planets being unconscious. Makes sense. Individuation, natural and brought forth by nature versus individualism brought on by ego. Absolutely, that's right. They all have great meaning. Jupiter as the positive animus, Venus as the positive anima, Sol as positive fatherly animus, Saturn as the negative or strong opinionated animus, Mars as an animus, Mercury as an anima. The Sun and Moon are interchangeable. And hi. Student of Rhythm says, talking about painting, I'm thinking of all the domestic scenes painted in the late 19th century and how alike they all are. I, for one, would be glad to see my painting. All right, let me just see if I can bring it up quickly because I think I can. May have to. It's cooking here. Let me move my camera aside just for a minute. And hello, Mr. Krishnamurti. Noticing that you're here. Sorry, I have to move my camera around so I can see around it. Okay. Where is this self-portrait? Okay, there it is. Of course, it comes up 8 times bigger than the space we have on the screen, so I have to make it smaller just a moment. Okay, so as I say, this portrait was from a photograph, and I never touched this portrait with a brush. I only used a palette knife, and after I was finished, I was actually just blown away. In fact, there were actually 2 photographs, one of me and my very cocky attitude as a Marine Corps First Lieutenant, and then the second one, the second photograph, which was 3 days later after a major battle. And I thought I was going to paint both as a before and after kind of juxtaposition, but I found that after I painted this particular image, I could not go back to the other one. And as I have often said, and many of you have heard, this image has everything that I have to say about the Vietnam War, and most of that is carried in the white of my left eye. And so I'll just leave it at that for now, but this is how, and obviously this is an archetypal image of some significance, at least to me. So anyway, that's that. And so Ian says, I have tried to find appropriate names for the animus equivalents to Eve, Helen, Mary, Sophia, arriving at Adam, David, John, Jesus, yeah, I suppose. And a student of rhythm says, wow, to the self-portrait, I appreciate that. And he can see that, he can see how everything is in there. Yeah, okay, thank you. That reconfirms my view about it. So anyway, Mr. Caleb says, it seems to me that the unconscious will push the ego to an encounter with the self, and that opens a window to the healing capacity of the pleroma. I think that that's a good analysis of it, Mr. Caleb. I'm going to go on reading here, and you're going to hear how the self is pushing on the ego all the time. And also how the space between religion and psychology opens a space for healing, and that relates to the same space you're talking about, I think. So let me go on with the reading now for those of you that have come for the reading. So I am still reading from The Living God and Our Living Psyche, What Christians Can Learn from Carl Jung by Belford Ulanov and Alvin Dueck or something, D-U-E-C-H. Let's see, is there anything about Mr. Dueck here? I guess not. I mean, Mr. Dueck has put his resume basically in this prologue of this book. And Anne Belford Ulanov is Emerita Professor of Psychiatry and Religion at Union Theological Seminary. Let's see. Mr. Caleb goes on, but unless the conscious mind gets on board with what the unconscious mind is trying to do, individuation remains incomplete. Yes, I agree with that. And Ian says, I always say, if there is no spirit realm, what then is the realm of the psyche? Well, there certainly is a spirit realm, and there certainly is a psyche. We get confused between psyche and soul, and I think that Jungians tend to use psyche and soul as synonymous, and spirit as that psychic energy which causes things to happen. And if you look at paragraph 751 of Answer to Job, which, if you're a member of our Dropbox, you can find in volume 11 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, paragraph 751, you will see that Dr. Jung says, I believe the psyche is real, he said. And he also said if that were not so, that it would have been either the uranium or the the laboratory equipment which created the atom bomb. So if you look around yourself right now, I've said many times, if you look around yourself right now, anything that you see in the room with you except potted plants is the result of the human psyche. And and so in that sense, the spirit is a part of the psyche, and it's a part of psychology. Robot Sybil says, Jungian understanding really could heal so many rifts, certainly not only personal. That's why I've been working with it for 30 years, because I'm interested in how it can be used to save us from ourselves in society. And that's why I wrote a book called Political Psychology, which you can find on Amazon, or you can find in the Dropbox for free. And if you're not a member of our Dropbox, send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will be happy to add you. Okay, I am going to go on with Dr. Ulanov's book, and this is a topic area which has a heading of otherness in the psyche. This internal plurality leads to another pressing pastoral issue that Jung raises, the place of otherness within the psyche. Otherness can simply be defined as those elements of experience that escape the grasp of the comprehending ego. Otherness eludes conceptualization, yet is fundamental to human experience. The modern ego, however, has been growing these past centuries. The modern ego, however, has been growing these past centuries. Now unencumbered by tradition, it revels in its uniqueness, autonomy, and self-sufficiency. This is an ego in control. The other person is perceived as an extension of oneself, as the same. For the other person to be truly different is a threat. The mystery of the other is domesticated. If the ego opens up in passive receptivity to the self, fulfillment is possible, but the notions of passivity and receptivity disrupt our modern sensibilities. The modern psyche is an active, pragmatic agent, assimilating the world and accommodating when necessary. Experiences of surrendering, submission, or being confronted conflict with the modern individual's proclivity for autonomy. I'll read that sentence once more. Experiences of surrender, submission, or being confronted conflict with the modern individual's proclivity for autonomy. Yet it is exactly this hubris and its encounter with otherness that Jung described in detail. The experience of otherness, which upsets the rational ego, is the source and summit of psychological wholeness, just as Jesus warns that those who seek to save their own life will lose it. Matthew 16:25. So Jung offers this pastoral response. Jung's approach brings back into discussion in the field of psychology that singular experience of otherness. There is that within the psychic economy, the unconscious, which the rational ego fails to comprehend. Jung refers to the interior, transcendent power of the psyche, this experience of the not I as the self. The self plays a pivotal role in organizing the totality of psychological functioning. In Jung's words, the self is, quote, a construct that serves to express an unknowable essence which cannot be grasped as such, since by definition it transcends our powers of comprehension. It might equally well be called the God within us. The beginnings of our whole psychic life seem to be inextricably rooted to this point, and all our highest and ultimate purposes seem to be striving toward it, unquote. Through the self emerge God images that reflect the presence of divine within the psyche. However, modern individuals easily dismiss such experiences because of their faith in epistemologically reductionistic forms of reason, scientific materialism, for example. This has made them tone-deaf to the call of the transcendent. Jung recognized this propensity in the modern and feared the consequences for civilization of suppressing the divine voice. Critical to the emergence of the self is the decentering of one's ego, a process that occurs when one is forced to confront the unknown parts of one's psyche through dreams, fantasies, and symptoms. The self demands conversation between the conscious and the unconscious. I want to repeat that sentence. The self demands conversation between the conscious and the unconscious. In working through contradictions and personal failures, psychological healing and transformation can occur. This activity of the self is what's called by Jung the transcendent function. By acting as a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, the self allows the individual to move beyond the one-sidedness of the dominant character traits expressed by the ego. In the agony of living, in suffering the contradictions of life, in this decentering of the ego, a new attitude, a novel way of being emerges, which has become more psychologically integrated. Jung stated, "I consider it my task and duty to educate my patients and pupils to the point where they can accept the direct demand that is made upon them from within." Linking otherness with Jung's concept of the self, Ulanov states, quote, "The self makes itself known as a presence or entity that is other than the ego, but has direct, far-reaching personal effects upon the ego. By other here, I mean that which is felt as sufficiently different from the ego to be experienced as an objective person that addresses its purposes, demands, or needs to the ego, and yet that is so similar to the ego and connected with it that the ego feels personally affected by its presence." Unquote. This concept of self and its activity as a functioning transcendent offered Jung a useful method for interpreting the expression of psychological phenomena as an internal drive toward wholeness. As an internal drive toward wholeness and transformation, rather than as emanating purely from pathology. Hence, anxiety or depression should be understood as the self seeking liberation from a tyrannical ego whose dominance may be actively promoting disintegration. Symptoms, then, are potentially a gift from the self in the service of promoting wholeness. So let me read that sentence again, because there are two sentences, because it's very important. Hence, anxiety or depression should be understood as the self seeking liberation from a tyrannical ego whose dominance may be actively promoting disintegration. Symptoms, then, are potentially a gift from the self in the service of promoting wholeness. For Jung, numinosity is often associated with the emergence of the self. It seizes and controls the human subject, who is always rather its victim than its creator. The numinosum is an experience of the subject independent of his will. The receptivity of the ego to the numinous self parallels the spiritual journey toward God as described by great mystics such as St. John of the Cross. As a bearer of the God image, the numinous self also resembles As a bearer of the God image, the numinous self also resembles the Christian theological concept of the Imago Dei. Jung's clear identification of the self with Judeo-Christian monotheism is evident in the response of some post-Jungians, such as James Hillman, who posited that Hellenistic polytheism rather than monotheism is the appropriate foundation of the self. For Hillman, monotheism too easily slips into totalitarianism and a constriction of imagination. Jung's self leans toward the unity implicit in oneness, monotheism. Okay, so just in terms of this numinosum issue, I'll put back up on the screen for a moment this image that I took during a time when I was having a period of some depression, and I went in the chapel at the U.S. Naval Academy, and as I was sitting there, the light came down on me and only me, and it was quite dark in the chapel, and as you see, the light from the sun came in, and it was quite numinous. You can see the luminosity even if you can't feel it as I experienced it. And so I'm not saying that that would be an experience that you would have necessarily, but I have such experiences, and my psyche, my self reacts to them as religious experiences, and so I take it as a message to me from my unconscious. Now, I acknowledge that it's simply a coincidence that I was sitting in that particular pew at that particular 2-minute period as the sun went by the window at the U.S. Naval Academy. But nonetheless, I think you can see how numinous it was, and how for medieval people and ancients to have such an experience, even if only one person has the experience, it could be quite numinous. So let me go on. Another distinctive characteristic of the biblical mentality noted by Berger that resembles Jung's thought is a, quote, pronounced openness toward the dimension of the other, unquote. That which was sacred, holy, and wholly other spoke to the ancients and informed their experience and identity. One should be cautious not to overstate the similarity between this notion of otherness found in Scripture and Jung's concept of the self. However, in paving the way for transcendence to speak in the therapeutic context, contemporary religious psychologists have not opened such a wide path for a sacred order to speak to us as has Jung in his articulation. As has Jung in his articulation of numinous experiences within psychic life. What Berger elucidates in the psychology of the New Testament, Jung intuited, but found absent in modernity. Jung can help us to recover a sacral psychology and draw out more clearly the call of God in Christ on the psyche. I would just add to this that the same can be said about any other religion. I've been around both Buddhism and Islam, and very similar things happen in those religions as well, and I think they happen in all religions. So then why should evangelicals read Jung? To summarize, we have suggested that Jung's critique of the effects of modernity is both prophetic and pastoral. Rather than simply accepting the secular self as a given, Jung created room for spirituality. Jung placed the complex plurality of the psyche in contrast to the monolithic ego that is still predominant in various contemporary psychological theories. He relativized the autonomous ego by suggesting that we are more fragmented than we realize, and by pointing to the other in the psyche that is not reducible by what is familiar. Now I'm going to skip ahead because then Dr. Dueck talks about a summary of the Ulanov essays, which are actually the meat of this book, and I'm reading from The Living God and Our Living Psyche, What Christians Can Learn from Carl Jung. So I will read what Mr. Dueck has to say here, but before I do, I'll just let me just see. So Shakina says, I always wonder how that works, though, because if it is collectively witnessed, how can it be created in our psyche? Surely there is an ultimate construct we share with subject views. Let's see, that's a very complex idea, so let me think about it for a minute. Let's see. All right, so Ian Shakina, I would say that you can collectively witness the will of God in civilization itself. And one of the issues that comes up with Dr. Ulanov is that she took exception to the Jungian point of view, Dr. Jung's point of view as expressed in Ion, among other places, that, and including in Answer to Job, that badness, evil, is half of the God image. And her point is that the good ultimately shines through, but it shines through at a different level. And her criticism was that Dr. Jung, for his own reasons, because he was trying to ease this information into a time when the scientific method was extremely strong, and meanwhile theology was on the other end of the spectrum. He was trying to slip this material in, and the way he chose to do it was to claim that he was a scientist and only talk about psychology and only talk about these issues from a psychological point of view. What Dr. Ulanov is doing is she's taking this a step farther by saying that, you know, we're complex creatures and we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And while it's all well and good, what Dr. Jung talked about in the opposites, and particularly that opposite of good and bad or good and evil being within the Godhead, she says that we can also think about religion at the same time. And if we do that, then we see that good shines through. And my insight recently has been that everything that you see in the world, in civilization, ultimately has emanated from the good side. And it isn't that everything is good, but everything that's bad keeps getting pushed out of the system. And there's a very interesting quote from the movie Gandhi, which I have always liked, and that is, throughout history, there have been tyrants, and for a time they can seem very strong, but in the end they always fall. Think of it, always. And that's a very powerful thought, but the point is that ultimately the good shows through in human nature and in every other thing in civilization. And I think this is Dr. Ulanov's point. So Robert Sibyl says, so interesting, the fractal nature of reality, self-similarity, kaleidoscopic reflections up and down the lines. Absolutely. In fact, my wife refers to me as her kaleidoscope, and she's quite right. I take pleasure in that description. Ian says, do you think it's creative feminine right hemisphere as anima and logical masculine left hemisphere as animus, the ultimate union being the God archetype? I would say that psychology and people like Jordan Peterson as an example, we've shot ourselves in the foot by referring to these things as masculine and feminine and anima and animus. We could, we've put labels on them, and as a result, we've brought with those labels all kinds of prejudice going way back. Okay, it's just like Elias Canetti talking about crowds and power, and one of the things he's talking about is this phrase that Adolf Hitler used to use, which was the diktat of Versailles. And he was referring to the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. And Canetti's point was that every time he used that reference, Hitler was turning the knife in the wound of the German people. And that's how World War II was brought up energetically. And so if we keep using these dichotomies in this way, I think that we may be shooting ourselves in the foot, and we might be better off trying to think of other ways of talking about it. Yes, I do agree that the ultimate union is the God archetype, if you will, the self, the God image archetype, let's say, because none of us can really say anything about the metaphysical God. This is why in Islam, no one is allowed to make an image of God, because they say that, God is ineffable, quite rightly. And one of the problems that we have in Christianity is that Michelangelo painted that nice picture of God touching the finger of Adam on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So all Christians know that image, and so therefore that picture of God as a muscular older man is the God image of many Christians, but there is no such being out there. We have telescopes that can look back to almost the Big Bang and down to the smallest quark, and we don't see God, and the reason is that God is not out there. And in fact, as Dr. Jung said correctly in Answer to Job, paragraph 752, every religious statement of whatever kind is a statement of the psyche, not a statement of the physis, not a statement of the physical world. And so think about that. Every religious statement of whatever kind is a statement of the psyche. And when I read that, I go, oh, of course. And but we've kept our minds off that by having this image of this Geppetto with his strings on the puppeteer with his strings on us all the time. But you know, that's not what God is, where he is, or how he does his business. And you know, one of the reasons that I've loved Dr. Jung's work is he's shown what God is, where he is, and how he goes about doing his business, which I tongue-in-cheek refer to as bumper cars. And as Dr. Jung rightly said, we humans have become the consciousness of God. I mean, that was one of the significant points that he made in Answer to Job. However, he was quite concerned that we don't go running off thinking that we're God. We're not God, but we're consciousness. And we're not the metaphysical God, but we each contain within us some scintilla of divinity. And so anyway, as they say, God works in mysterious ways, and one of those ways is bumper cars, which is crashing us into one another and creating, therefore, civilization. And so student of rhythm says so Ian says, or is it more masculine mind, feminine heart? Well, those are metaphors, and I'm not sure those serve us well, actually, anymore. I mean, obviously, when we were coming to consciousness, they did, but there's limitations. The experience of otherness and hubris. I was just reading another article about this, referencing the biblical figure of Nimrod with his megalomania. Okay, I don't know anything about Nimrod, so I'll leave it to others to explore that right now. Caleb says, sounds like prayer. Not sure what we're referring to here since I've been off on a tangent, and I apologize for that. Student of Rhythm says, symptoms as a gift, wonderful. Reminds me of the permaculture teacher once saying that weeds are an indication of conditions in your soil that you can learn to understand rather than just try to kill. Okay, fair enough. I think that's fair enough. So, okay, so now I'm going to finish these last 4 pages of Mr. Dueck's prologue to this book, The Living God and Our Living Psyche. What Christians can learn from Carl Jung by Belford Ulanov and Alvin Dueck. So I'm on page 24 of the prologue, the Ulanov Essays. Belford Ulanov is the Christian Brooks Johnson professor of psychiatry and religion at Union Theological Seminary, a psychoanalyst in private practice, and a member of the Jungian Psychoanalytical Association and of the International Association of Analytical Psychology. She is the recipient of an honorary doctorate from Virginia Theological School and from the Loyola Graduate Department in Pastoral Counseling and from Christian Theological Seminary. She has also received the Distinguished Alumna Award from the Blanton Peale Institute, the Vision Award from the National Association for the Advancement of Psychoanalysis, the Oscar Pfister Award from the American Psychiatric Association for distinguished work in depth psychology and religion, and the Distinguished Contribution Award from the American Association of Pastoral Counselors for distinguished work in depth psychology and religion. And I'll bet most of us never knew that the work in depth psychology and religion ever got started. It came as somewhat of a surprise to me, but it certainly attracted me to Dr. Ulanov's work after I realized who she was. From the beginning of her professional career, Ulanov has engaged in issues of integrating Christian faith and theology with depth psychology. In her essays here, she invites the reader to participate in the healing transformation of psyche and soul that can occur in the space between psychology and theology. However, as Ulanov argues, there is a Christian fear of the psyche that impedes conversation between these two fields. I would add that there's also a psychologist fear of talking about theology, so that's a bridge that needs to be built. Ulanov offers us a bridge to traverse between Jung's thought and Christian faith. In building this bridge, Ulanov resists the temptation to collapse one mode of discourse into another. Rather, she allows a legitimate space in which honest, authentic conversation can occur. In other work, Ulanov reminded her readers that each dialogue partner must maintain a separate identity while simultaneously being changed by the interaction. She characterizes herself as standing in a parallel manner between psychology and theology, and between the ego and the self, encouraging conversation. And this is what I absolutely agree is necessary. Her objective is not to make Christianity acceptable to Jungian perspectives, and she does not simply baptize Jung so that he will be acceptable to evangelicals. Each has a contribution to make. Depth psychology is a corrective to an overly spiritualized faith, pointing to the everydayness, the messiness of experience and incarnation. But the Christian faith is our mother tongue. and it determines our identity. Ulanov does not hesitate to suggest where Jung overstepped his self-proclaimed boundaries for sticking strictly with the psychological. At the same time, she shows that Christians can benefit from this conversation with Jung as well, helping us to acknowledge some of the blind spots that often keep us from living out more fully core convictions. In the following essays, Ulanov addresses three major issues: reductionism, femininity and the shadow, and God images. We will briefly review these central concerns to help to provide some context for her discussion. Reductionism. Christian faith contains a surfeit of meaning and mystery that no single theory can capture. In her first essay, Ulanov addresses reasons for the fear of the psyche, psychological reductionism among Christians in general and evangelicals in particular. Ulanov suggests that this fear partly concerns a perceived translation of Christianity into psychological terms. When one speaks about the rich biblical narrative in terms of a simpler and supposedly more acceptable schema, the fear naturally arises that Christianity will not fit on the Procrustean bed without some mutilation. Some have been concerned that Jungian notions of universal archetypes and individuation have been used to reinterpret faith. What is overlooked, Ulanov suggests, is that Jung was on an intense spiritual journey, as all of us are, to find an authentic way to respond to the real God. In this analysis, we find that Jung provides a way to think about Christianity as embodied in human experience. The psyche becomes a medium through which God speaks to us within the concrete, tangible realities of our day-to-day existence. Recognizing the inextricable psychological element in our spiritual journey does not negate or subvert the interpretive role of dogma and history, but adds to it another dimension. If this is so, we are implored to concern ourselves with the medium through which God's voice is heard. That medium, our psyche, is conditioned by personal and collective histories. In discerning the voice of God, we inevitably must ask ourselves what extraneous elements attach to our faith that detract from an encounter with the transcendent. God is one who speaks through the psyche as well as through revelation, and here in human experience is where we meet, or refuse to meet, the living God. The shadow and the feminine. In her second essay, Ulanov addresses those parts of the psyche and of our faith that are often left undeveloped, namely the shadow and the feminine. These are themes she has addressed on several previous works. Jung pointed to what appeared to be the dark element of the divine. What does one do with those darker images of God? Since we come to know God through our psyche, we must, Ulanov suggests, be prepared for the muck of our own inner stable in which the divine is born. Inherited with the pure gracious gift of God's self are the unacceptable parts of our lives that get attached to our views of God. Another focus of this essay concerns feminine aspects of our faith. Ulanov suggests that we think of ourselves in more feminine terms as modeled by Mary and as suggested by scriptural texts that link the believer to Christ as his bride. This metaphor has also been used to express, link the believer to Christ as his bride. Let me give you the footnote. The footnote is Revelation 19, 7 through 10, Matthew 9, 15, and John 3, 29. This metaphor has also been used to express Yahweh's relationship with Israel, Isaiah 62, 5. As the church, we house God as Mary carried Jesus in her womb. As the church, we house God as Mary carried Jesus in her womb. This maternal language, used since the early church, provides a helpful corrective to more paternal approaches, which have tended toward theological intellectualization and propositional truths. The feminine mode of being, conversely, invites us into more embodied and communal elements of our faith to become receptive vessels of the Holy Other, who fills us individually and communally. God images. In her third essay, Ulanov details the role of God images and their relationship to a living faith. The topic of God's image in the human soul emerges repeatedly in Ulanov's writing, both in her individual works and in works that she wrote with her late husband, Barry Ulanov. In a work dedicated to the Jungian concept of the transcendent function, Ulanov shows how the transcendent appears in clinical work, how to be sensitive to this presence in dreams and symptoms, and how the presence of the transcendent informs the encounter between therapist and client. And I'll just mention the footnote. The footnote is to Dr. Ulanov's work entitled The Functioning Transcendent, a Study in Analytical Psychology. She has also examined the nature of God images that surface in prayers, dreams, and experiences of the holy. That's in a book called Picturing God. The Ulanovs co-authored a work dealing with the centrality of imagination in the spiritual life, particularly with regard to preaching, prayer, teaching, counseling, and politics. This is the healing imagination. The footnote is to the healing imagination. So since I'm interested in how all this applies to politics, you can be sure I'll be reading the healing imagination next. According to Ulanov, there exists a space between subjective and objective God images. Our personal God image may even deviate greatly from those received by tradition. However, what lies within this space is a living God whose presence is mediated through a dynamic, dialectic interplay between our schemas and a simultaneous separation from them. Jung's theory of opposites and the psyche's transcendent function help us to think psychologically about the activity occurring within the space and to pay special attention to its healing properties. If we struggle to go on praying and being faithful, Ulanov says, we navigate the inevitable breakdown and reconstruction of all of our images, because nothing finite can encompass the infinite. Because nothing finite can encompass the infinite, unoriginated God. And that's that's a portion of the prologue written by Alvin Dueck and Brian W. Becker. And so this completes my reading from The Living God and Our Living Psyche, What Christians Can Learn from Carl Jung by Belford Ulanov and Alvin Dueck. Now, I just urge you that these are very rich essays, and the portion of this book that I've read is only a sort of superficial précis of the book, and so I'd urge you to take a look at it. So let me see. My goodness, we have lots more here. And Excalibur says, can there be multiple beings within the psyche, hierarchical in nature? Certainly that's true, and you're coming in late on this live stream, so I would urge you to go back and listen to the beginning of this video where we discuss those issues. Shakina says, thank you for this conversation. I rarely find brains to pick that have so much fruit. I truly appreciate it. Excalibur, I believe that is the cast indeed. At a minimum, we would have a masculine and feminine being, but also different levels of awareness in each, such as Jung's Eve, Helen, Mary, Sophia. I believe our base construct of psyche is along the same lines as the structure of our solar system. Self as the sun, different aspects of animus constructed by planets in orbit. Yet at the end of the day, even soul has an orbit of a greater center. You could also place the self as the earth in the about metaphor, or in the above metaphor, I guess. I guess in the end, it's at least a tool to start the imagination in a direction of comprehension. Thanks, as always. Okay, and that's from a student of rhythm. So, yes, those metaphors, all those metaphors are good, and they have been coming forth from astrologers for millennia. And at this point, we'd have to say that we simply don't know how deeply embedded those ideas are in our psyche. In other words, Dr. Jung did make a fairly comprehensive study of astrology, and the first image in the Red Book, I'm not sure I can go grab it right away, but the first image in the Red Book does indicate the significance of astrology and the fact that humans are moving into the age of Aquarius out of the age of Pisces. And Dr. Jung did a lot of writing about how astrological ideas have sort of structured the way we have faced the world. And so that same as astrological idea, though different, you can also find on a placemat at any Chinese restaurant where they have the 12 Chinese zodiacal signs. I'm a dog year person, and you find descriptions there, and very often those descriptions are very accurate. I know I think the discussion of the dog year person is correct vis-a-vis me. Now, why that's true, I don't know, okay? But I do know that these things have happened unconsciously over thousands of years. And let me give you an example of how that might happen. In Japan, there was a battle in the Hiroshima area around somewhere between 700 and 900 AD. And in the end, the samurai on the losing side had to commit suicide. And ever since then, the fishermen in that area around the inland sea of Japan would bring up crabs from the inland sea, and they would flop them over so that they could look at their belly. And when they saw on the belly of the crab that it appeared to be the face of a samurai, in full armor, by the way, when they saw that image, they would throw the crab back. But if they didn't see that image, they would eat the crab, or bring it in as the catch of the day. So as that occurred over about 1,500 years now, pretty much all the crab in that part of the inland sea, every time you pull one out, its belly looks exactly like a samurai. Go figure. And so these things happen unconsciously. And do I believe that the soul of a samurai is in a crab? No, I don't. But nonetheless, you can see how human beings over thousands of years might have gotten that idea, and you can see the way that both astrology in the West and astrology in China may have come up, obviously differently, but each one has its own truths to it. And so they're not wrong. And let me see, can I find, I'm not even going to try, but if you look at my reading of the Red Book on this channel, you can find the first image that appears in the Red Book, which is an image in Switzerland that shows a lake in the foreground and the mountains in the background, and it has a ship tied up in the image, and beneath the image it shows fish in the sea, and then different creatures in the ground under the sea, and it shows some zodiacal signs, which Dr. Jung intentionally put in there, and that's in the very first image in the Red Book. It's quite a tome, but I guess I can show it to you. Sorry. Okay. All right. This is the image to which I refer, and so you can study that if you go get a real copy of the folio edition. And underneath this video and the one I did yesterday, you'll find a link to a very short 3.5-minute video about the creation of the Red Book and how it came to be published, and I'd urge you to take a look at that. So Shakina says, astrology saved my life. It's how I found Jung, Christ myself. Learning your moon sign is the most profound truth of astrology. I don't doubt it. I'm sure there are millions of people that feel that way. She says, you are truly awesome. Skip a positive Jupiter type animus for me, at least. Gee, it's too bad you live in Australia. Anyway, I think you mentioned that, or New Zealand, I guess. Yeah, I see it clearly. The eons construct a temperament that we are predispositioned toward. Interesting note, the Chinese dog is Aries, the tiger is Leo, the horse is Sagittarius, Aquarius is monkey. Match those up and it all lines into the same information of the tree of life, and the 12 fruits, etc. That is very interesting. Especially the Chinese dog being Aries, because Aries, of course, is the god of war, is one of the gods of war, if I understand it correctly, from Greek mythology. And at least as far as my knowledge of this goes, which is limited to the movie Wonder Woman. So, but you know, since I served in the military, but I don't, I no longer brandish weapons. My weapons are here, and that's a different kind of warfare. And so anyway, I will, let's see, did Shakina tell us where she was from before? I thought you did, but I may, yes, morning from New Zealand. So thank you for joining us from New Zealand. It's a country my wife has visited, but not me. And I would certainly love to visit someday. But we have to find a way to do that. So anyway, thank you for joining me today. And don't hesitate to, everyone that's watching this video, don't hesitate to write to me and communicate with me about any issues that are relevant. I'm not a mental health professional, so I won't answer your mental health questions, but I certainly will communicate with you and be receptive to any approaches. So Shakina says, a real man's sword is his tongue. Thank you. Well, thank you. Grenade says, what was your title or rank in the Marines? My rank was Lieutenant Colonel. Finally, I retired as Lieutenant Colonel. And I have a number of notable classmates from my class in the Marine Corps. The most famous of those is Oliver North, who became infamous during the Iran-Contra scandal. Then there's Jim Webb, who became U.S. Senator from Virginia. And he's only served one term, unfortunately. I'm sorry about that, because I thought he was an excellent senator, and he's an excellent writer. He wrote a book called Fields of Fire, which was a very popular book, and he served as Secretary of the Navy in the Reagan administration. And I think he was only 38 years old when he got that job, so that's pretty impressive that he, as a Marine, became Secretary of the Navy. And then the last, but certainly not the least, is Rich Higgins, who, when serving as a Lieutenant Colonel as the commanding officer of peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping forces in southern Lebanon, was captured and hanged by Hezbollah. And a picture of him hanging was on the front page of every newspaper in the world. At some point, this happened in 1989, I believe. And then I would be remiss if I didn't also mention my roommate, Robert M. Christian, Jr., who died in Vietnam on April the 11th, 1969. And Bob is sorely missed. So Shakina says, Jordan Peterson said it best when he said Jung had a very intimating intellect in regards to depth before its time. Do you mean intimating or intimidating? I think you must. Intimating would mean that he had a suggesting intellect, which is definitely true. He knew that he would be posthumous. He knew that he was not going to be received well around the world in his lifetime, although he definitely was. I mean, in intellectual circles, he received a honorary doctorate from Clark University in 1909, for example. So he was well received around the world. And Shakina says it's intimidating. Yes, intimidating would absolutely be the truth. And as Edward Edinger, who was, if you look at the front page of this YouTube channel, you'll find 3 important videos about Edward Edinger. And he said that all of us are Lilliputians compared to Carl Jung, and I certainly have to admit that. I know that no matter what I can say or do over the rest of my lifetime, I can't even scratch the surface of the depth of his intellect and knowledge. And so, yes, it is intimating too, because he pointed the way. And so in my own experience now, I've been reading and working with Dr. Jung's work now almost for 32 years, for 31 and a half years. And what I have always found is that it's helped me maintain my mental health, my balance, my psychic balance. And so my friends in my local community and my colleagues sort of got tired of hearing me lecture them about Jung, and so they said, why don't you go write a book? Why don't you go create a website? And so on. So I have done, and these videos, which I've now been doing for 2.5 years, and this is, I don't know, the 789th video that are all on this site. There's no shortage of further discussion about these things, but I know that no matter what I do, I can never hold a candle to what Carl Jung was able to do, and he accepted that his fame and what he had accomplished would be realized only after his death. Renaud says most people would have gone insane to see what he saw. That's probably true, and he even says that on the Red Book. Let me see if I can find the actual quote. Well, he says that this is on the back cover. He says, the years of which I have spoken to you, when I pursued the inner images, were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this. It began at that time, and the later details hardly matter anymore. My entire life consisted in elaborating what had burst forth from the unconscious and flooded me like an enigmatic stream and threatened to break me. That was the stuff and material for more than only one life. Everything later was merely the outer classification, the scientific elaboration, and the integration into life. But the numinous beginning, which contained everything, was then. And that's actually not the quote I was looking for, but you can see, if you go to that link about the making of the Red Book, you can definitely have an appreciation for how important and central this book is. Let's see if this is the quote. This is the Epilogue, and it's dated 1959. He worked on this, well, I'll let him tell the story. It's dated 1959. I worked on this book for 16 years. My acquaintance with alchemy in 1930 took me away from it. The beginning of the end came in 1928 when Richard Wilhelm, sent me the text of The Golden Flower, an alchemical treatise. There, the contents of this book found their way into actuality, and I could no longer continue working on it. To the superficial observer, it will appear like madness. It would also have developed into one had I not been able to absorb the overpowering force of the original experiences. With the help of alchemy, I could finally arrange them into a whole. I always knew that these experiences contained something precious, and therefore I knew of nothing better than to write them down in a precious, that is to say, a costly book, and to paint the images that emerged through reliving it all as well as I could. I knew how frightfully inadequate this undertaking was, but despite much work and many distractions, I remained true to it, even if another possibility never. And then he breaks off in the middle of a sentence. So, anyway, the interesting news is that it's my understanding that this Red Book contains only 55% of the total material that Sonu Shamdasani had available to him. And you might get an appreciation of that, again, by looking at the 3.5-minute documentary that I've linked underneath this video. So some more things are to be published from this, and it may be in a book called the Black Books, which were the raw material for the Red Book. And also, recently I read that, actually it was in the, I'll tell you where I read it. This book just came out November 1st. It's called The Making of Modern Psychology. And what happened was that Dr. Freud wrote a book about the history of psychology way back in the early 20th century. And let me just read one thing here. So between 1933 and 1941, he gave a series of lectures at the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, and that's abbreviated ETH. So some people interested in Jung started to publish these lectures. The first 16 of them are related to the history of modern psychology, and that is the first of 8 volumes to be published. And in the foreword, it mentions that it's talking about the significance of ETH for Jung. And it says, I'm just going to read the last part of it. It says, ETH honored Jung with an honorary doctorate on the occasion of his 80th birthday in 1955. In his will, 1958, Jung decreed that his literary estate should be left to ETH. However, lengthy preparatory work was required before his heirs could ratify the handover of documents to ETH in 1977. There's still a lot more to be published. And so Dr. Jung is certainly a giant, an intellectual giant of the new millennium, and we all need to try to figure out what the heck he was saying to us. And Granat says, C.G. Jung was a lifesaver for me, felt less alone, and I would certainly concur with that because I had an experience very much like Dr. Jung's experience, and complete with psychogenic people, and I didn't know what to do with it. I put it in my drawer for 21 years, and it was when his Red Book came out in 2009, it said, aha, this is what happened to Jung himself, the same thing that happened to me. And that was huge in helping me. So Shakina says, same for me. Jung has given my coping mechanisms for my own mental health. I am only 4 years a student and only 32 in age. Well, I've got you by 40 years. But definitely I don't see any reason to go beyond. Well, I obviously am going beyond Jung, but I'm going to Jung and his disciples, let's say. And so if any of you are interested, we are still running the seminar on ion, researches into the phenomenology of the self. There have already now been 25 sessions. These are all on video. They've all been done on Zoom, and so they're available to members of the seminar, but they are not public and they're not in the YouTube channel. That's an additional source of material from what I've been doing. And Shakina says, funny how that works. You end up more alone because everyone else falls away, but you feel less alone because someone else helps you understand more. Hopefully I won't be in the desert 40 years to get there. I doubt that you'll be in the desert 40 years. I've certainly tried to put a lot of material here that'll help you get out of the desert. And there's a famous Jung quote about that, which is that you know, you're not alone because you have people around you, but you end up anyway being alone, because ultimately when you individuate, you recognize that it's you that's responsible for your life and no one else. And hopefully I can help with that to some extent. So I have been